A Christian man in Egypt has been sentenced to 5 years. Yes, 5 years of hard labor for, ready for it? Defending Christianity on YouTube. Well, Mariam Wahba, research analyst at FDD, joins us now. Mariam, what is going on here?
Well, it's good to be with you. Look, the story starts in October when this young Coptic Christian researcher was arrested for Egypt's blasphemy laws. And when you think of blasphemy laws, you're probably thinking this is an ancient thing that no longer exists, but in fact, it does. Most Muslim majority countries have some sort of blasphemy laws that are intended by the state to create what they call social cohesion or religious cohesion. In practice, these blasphemy laws are used to target Christian and other ethnic and religious minorities, as we're seeing play out here in Egypt.
Okay, Mariam, you were born in Egypt, so this is obviously personal to you. And when we hear the term 5 years of hard labor, will they actually make him do that?
Look, this is a state that does enforce its judgments. And what we're learning about this case is that this young man who runs a YouTube channel with over 100,000 followers, in which he posts videos in which he explains Christianity and defends Christianity, and he was sentenced for misuse of social media and religious contempt as outlined by Egypt's blasphemy laws. So, unless something changes, in the coming weeks and months, this man will serve his 5 year sentence. And in attempt at shedding light on this case, what we at FTD are trying to do is enforce what the US mandates of Egypt as part of our relationship. Washington and Cairo have a long and strengthened relationship as enforced by what's called the foreign military funding. And essentially, the United States gives Egypt $1.3 billion on average a year for security assistance. And in doing so, Egypt signs on to meet certain conditions as outlined by US law. And this includes things like progress on human rights and progress on religious persecution. And Egypt has made commitments, verbal and through signing on to this FMF package, that it will continue to make improvements. And this law, or excuse me, this judgment is um, a flashpoint in this relationship because it demonstrates that Egypt is not willing to follow through on the commitments it has made to Washington.
Now, famously, Egypt is home of the Coptic Christians. And I think for maybe a lot of folks in the United States, we hear Protestant, we hear Catholic, we even hear something like Eastern Orthodox, and we're like, okay, I can understand that. But I think for I might be oversimplifying, but for an American audience, the idea of the Coptic Church is kind of an over there thing. Not really sure what's going on. So I know this is a broad question, but what is the state of the Coptic Church in Egypt?
Absolutely. So the Coptic people are the indigenous people of Egypt, and they are descendants of the pharaohs. And Saint Mark the Evangelist traveled to Egypt to evangelize around 60 to 70 A.D. And because the ancient Egyptians had similar ideas to Christianity of a forgiving God and an afterlife, they quickly began to convert to Christianity. And in the next few centuries, we see that Egypt was a majority Christian country. Some researchers put it up as high as 85%. And then you had the Arab invasion of North Africa and Arabia. And that's when you see mass conversions and deaths and persecution start to happen in Egypt. And you had a population shift. Today, Egypt is about 10 to 15% Coptic Christian. And it hasn't been easy for the Copts in the last few centuries. Obviously, certain leaders, certain presidents have brought certain levels of persecution, some higher than others. What we've seen in the years after the Arab Spring in 2011 and then 2013 is the Egyptian state trying to reconcile how it ought to treat its Christian minority group. And President Sisi has to be applauded for his fight against Islamism, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood, which he overthrew in a military coup, and ISIS, and so on and so forth. But I think what's notable about the state of Copts today is that the persecution is all encompassing. It's not exactly ISIS type church blowing up, but it is happening elsewhere in civil life and social life. I'm talking about things like Copts can't get into certain schools, Copts can't get certain jobs because they are deemed as second class citizens or really enemies of the state. When there are mob attacks, Certain villages will burn churches or attack Christians. And of course, in the eyes of the law, Coptic Christians are almost not full citizens. In the courts, a Copt's testimony is worth a little bit less than that of a Muslim's testimony. We see reconciliation sessions after attacks on Coptic Christians where there's a perpetrator and there's a victim, and there's the victim Coptic Christian, and they're kind of forced into these reconciliation sessions that let the perpetrator go off the hook. And essentially, there's a culture of impunity in the Egyptian state towards the persecution of Copts, meaning that bad things happen to Copts and nobody gets punished for it.
Wow. Well, let's say you had a direct phone line to whoever's in charge of I think you said $1.3 billion. What would you want the United States government to do in this exact moment?
Look, now you're asking the $1 million question. There isn't much that we actually have to do proactively on this issue. The fact of the matter is, the United States government has these laws, codified laws within our foreign military funding that says Egypt must, in engaging with Washington, make progress on these issues. And I think if I had the direct phone line to the Pentagon, the person that enforces the conditions of our foreign military funding, I would tell them enforce the law, meaning Egypt is not following through on the promises and commitments it has made to Washington. Therefore, we got to withhold some of that money and stop issuing waivers for large portions of that funding. And we can tell Cairo that they will get that security assistance as soon as they make movements and improvements on religious persecution issues.
And this is just such a hard thing, I think, for an American audience to contextualize, that someone who is simply doing Christian apologetics could get 5 years of hard labor for doing that. That is absolutely insane. But I thank you for coming on and spreading awareness for it. Obviously, we're going to have you back on to see, hopefully, that something happens in the right direction. But as for now, my friend, thanks for coming on, and God bless.
Thank you for having me.